They found him there, beneath the skeletal shadow of a burned-out house, his fur matted with soot and ash, the rain dripping slowly from the jagged edges of his ears. The world around him was silent, except for the soft patter of water against broken glass, and yet somehow the German shepherd's eyes held the weight of every loss he had ever known. He was still a sentinel of grief, crouched over an empty car seat that no longer held the warmth of a child. This story will break you and then rebuild you. It will ask you to sit with sorrow so heavy, it feels like it could drown you, only to lift you with the quiet courage of a dog who refuses to let the world forget the small miracles that remain. Like, share, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? The rain had soaked the street, washing shadows into puddles that reflected the trembling neon of a distant street lamp. I remember the smell first, wet asphalt, smoke lingering from the house behind him, and something else, something warmer, almost like the faint memory of milk and blankets. He did not move when I approached, did not flinch, but the way his head lifted ever so slightly, sniffing the air, told me he had been waiting for someone, or perhaps for something he could no longer name. His paws were blackened, sticky with the residue of whatever fire had scarred this block, yet his posture was proud, almost regal. There was no fear in his gaze, only vigilance. He had seen something the rest of us had missed, a quiet truth that hovered in the air unspoken. I crouched slowly, careful not to startle him. My voice, soft and almost hesitant, barely rose above the whisper of rain. "It's okay, boy. I won't hurt you." For a long moment he only stared, and then a shiver ran through his body, a tremor that seemed less about cold and more about exhaustion, grief, and something else. Hope, perhaps. And then I saw it. A single frayed blanket tucked into the car seat, soaked through, the edges curled with neglect. The air smelled faintly of baby powder and smoke. The dog lowered his head to it, nuzzling it with such reverence that it was impossible not to feel the quiet ache of devotion pressing down on my chest. I remembered then the stories my grandmother used to tell me, the ones about animals who could feel the weight of human sorrow and carry it silently without complaint. I had never truly believed them, until that moment, watching the shepherd's chest rise and fall in the rhythm of grief. His eyes, dark and reflective, seemed almost to speak. "I am here. I will guard this no matter what." The street was empty. Broken glass glittered in the shallow puddles, a soft echo of stars that would never appear in the smog-filled night. And above it all, the rain continued its steady hymn, a quiet witness to something neither of us could name yet, but both of us understood. Hours might have passed before I noticed the subtle changes, the small twitch of his ears at a distant noise, the way his body angled protectively toward the empty car seat, and the faint warmth of his breath fogging against the soaked blanket. He was patient, uncomplaining, and entirely painfully aware of his duty. At that moment, I realized that he was not guarding an empty seat. He was guarding hope. He was guarding the memory of something fragile, something small, that had touched his world and left it changed forever. I knelt there, letting the rain soak through my coat, and for the first time, I allowed myself to be quiet with him, to share the vigil, to acknowledge the weight of waiting for something that might never return. And then, somewhere deep in the shadows, I thought I heard it, the faintest, almost imperceptible coo, like a whisper carried by the wind. I could not tell if it was my mind playing tricks or something else entirely, but the dog's ears pricked. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes scanning the darkness with a focus so sharp it felt like it cut through the wet night itself. I did not know then what would happen next. I did not know that the night held more revelations, more quiet miracles, but I knew with every fiber of my being that we were both on the threshold of something that would change us forever. The shepherd, patient, scarred, and noble, and I, humbled by his quiet endurance, were beginning a story neither of us could yet imagine, yet both of us were ready to follow. The rain fell harder, the world blurred around us, and still he stayed. I watched him silent, vigilant, and I understood that some bonds do not need words. They only need presence, patience, and trust. The rain began to thin, leaving the streets slick with a mirrored reflection of the dim city lights. The German shepherd remained where he had been, unmoving, a silent guardian of absence. I did not speak. My presence was unnecessary. There was something in his stillness, a patience that made time itself feel suspended, and yet beneath that calm exterior, I sensed a story buried in the grime and ash of his coat, a story waiting for someone willing to see it. As I crouched closer, my gaze traced the contours of his body. His fur was riddled with scars, some fresh, some older, faint lines etched like the cartography of a difficult life. There was a stiffness in his left hind leg, subtle but persistent, the kind that spoke of old injuries never fully healed. And around his neck, partially hidden beneath matted fur, was a collar, worn, frayed, engraved with letters that were nearly indecipherable, their edges blurred from water and time. I leaned closer, careful not to disturb him. The name was almost lost, but I could make out a faint trace. Rex. Rex. Even saying it aloud felt strange, intimate, almost forbidden, like trespassing on a private memory. I wondered how many nights he had spent alone, waiting for someone who might never return, and how many times he had been misunderstood, overlooked, abandoned. The sheer endurance in his eyes, quiet, patient, unshakable, was humbling. I reached out slowly, letting my hand hover just above his head. He did not flinch, did not move away, but there was a tension in his muscles that spoke of readiness. He was alert, yes, but also weary. I whispered almost to myself, "Rex, you've been through a lot, haven't you?" He tilted his head slightly, nostrils flaring as if to answer, and I could not tell whether he recognized my voice or simply understood my intention. I stayed there for what felt like hours, letting the rain wash over both of us, letting the silence stretch into something almost sacred. And in that silence, images began to surface in my mind, fragments of a past that was not mine but somehow intertwined with him. I saw a narrow street lined with brick buildings, the kind where every doorstep tells a story. I imagined him there once, bounding with a family that had loved him fiercely, the sound of laughter echoing off the walls. He had been a pup then, unbroken, full of energy and curiosity, his ears too large for his head, his paws awkward in their eagerness. There had been a small boy no older than 3, with chubby cheeks and eyes that mirrored the warmth of the sun. The boy had held Rex's leash in tiny hands, dragging him along with more determination than sense, and Rex had followed, patient and protective. And then the shadow fell. I saw the boy reach for the street one moment, the next. A blur of motion, a car, the screech of brakes, the sudden, unbearable silence. Rex had tried to intervene, lunging, barking, a frenzy of fur and instinct, but it was too late. The memory did not linger as a clear image. It remained fragmented, blurred at the edges like a photograph damaged by rain. Only the echo remained, the boy's small cry muffled by chaos, and the look of helplessness on Rex's face. I shivered, feeling a cold tremor run through me, as though the memory itself had seeped into the present. Could it be true, or was this my mind weaving a narrative out of the sorrow I sensed in him? I could not know. But the weight in his eyes suggested he carried something more than the typical burdens of stray life. He carried memory, loss, and perhaps guilt, the kind of guilt that animals feel without words, the kind that ties them to moments they cannot change. I shifted slightly, my eyes tracing his body again. There were other signs, subtle but telling, a faint limp in the left hind leg, the way he occasionally shifted his weight to protect it, the scars along his shoulders and chest, punctures likely from fights, narrow escapes or misguided humans. He was not simply a lost dog, he was a survivor, a creature who had endured more than any ordinary observer could comprehend. Each mark, each frayed edge of fur, told a story of resilience, of survival in a world that often moved too quickly to notice the quiet struggles of its creatures. And then my eyes fell on the car seat again, the frayed blanket tucked within. I did not touch it. I could not. But I studied it, letting my mind wander through the possibilities. Perhaps it had been abandoned here after a sudden departure, a hurried escape or a tragedy too sharp to name. Rex's devotion to it was not just about guarding an object. It was about guarding a fragment of life, a memory, a hope. His loyalty was absolute, and in that loyalty, I began to see the threads of a story that demanded attention, patience, and care. I crouched lower, letting my hands brush the rain-slick pavement, and allowed myself to feel the texture of the night. The air was heavy with moisture, but also with the faint aroma of charred wood, wet earth, and something almost sweet, the trace of life that lingered despite the ruin. The shepherd's eyes followed every movement, his tail a slow, deliberate sweep, never idle, never careless. He was aware of me, assessing me, weighing my intentions without a word. Time passed differently there in that quiet vigil. Every droplet of rain that fell, every distant siren, every rustle of wind through broken windows seemed magnified, heightened, meaningful. I imagined the days and nights Rex had spent alone, each one folding into the next without distinction, each one an exercise in patience, vigilance, and quiet despair. And yet, despite everything he had endured, guarding, waiting, surviving, I could see him in motion, not as he was now, but in glimpses of the past, bounding down alleyways, his muscles rippling, eyes bright with purpose, running to greet a hand he trusted, a child he loved, a home he once knew. Then the image would shatter, replaced by the present. Soaked fur, the solemn tilt of his head, the silent demand of vigilance. I whispered again, softly, to fill the space between us with something human, something warm. "You've been waiting, haven't you? All this time. You've been waiting." He lowered his gaze, nudging the blanket in the car seat with a paw, his motion slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. In that act, I understood something fundamental. He was not guarding because he had to, or because he was commanded. He was guarding because he remembered. He was guarding because he carried within him a bond so deep, so visceral, that it transcended language, transcended human logic. He was guarding the invisible presence of a child, the echo of laughter that might have been, the possibility of reunion, the fragile hope of connection. Night deepened, the rain finally giving way to a thin mist that clung to the broken windows and streetlights. I sat beside him, letting the silence envelop us. I had no name for him yet, no claim on his story, and yet I felt inexplicably connected. Something about this encounter, this silent communion with a dog so profoundly scarred and loyal, felt like the beginning of something inevitable, a bond that would demand attention, empathy, and patience. I did not know then what had brought him here, to this burned-out street, to this empty car seat, to this moment where our lives brushed against each other. But I knew that I had been chosen to witness it, to bear silent testimony to the quiet, aching nobility of a dog who had loved, lost, and continued to guard when no one else would. And somehow in that awareness, I felt the first fragile stirrings of trust, not just in him, but in the possibility that the world could still hold moments of grace, even after immense loss. The shepherd rested his head on the edge of the car seat, eyes half closed but still alert. The blanket cradled the echo of a life he had not abandoned. And in the misty, rain-slicked quiet, I began to understand that this was not merely a dog waiting for a child. This was a soul waiting to be seen, a bond waiting to be rekindled, a story waiting to be told. Hours later, as the mist thickened and the city lights flickered through the haze, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The weight of his patience, his grief, his unspoken loyalty pressed against my chest with a strange comfort. I knew in that moment that our paths had crossed for a reason, though the full shape of it was still hidden, and I waited as he waited, for the next fragment of this story to reveal itself. Morning came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the world itself needed to mourn the night before. A thin grey light filtered through the remnants of clouds, painting the wet pavement in muted silver and gold. The German shepherd, Rex, I had come to call him silently, remained curled near the car seat, the frayed blanket clutched beneath his chin. He did not stir at the light's intrusion, only shifted slightly, muscles coiled but still, his eyes half closed yet alert. I sat nearby on the curb, letting the chill seep through my coat, feeling the persistent dampness in my bones. The night's rain had not left him cleansed or softened. It had merely illuminated the layers of his suffering. Each scar, each frayed tuft of fur told a story I could not yet name. And yet, beneath the visible weariness, I sensed something deeper, something older, a memory that belonged to him alone, one that had brought him to this street, this empty car seat, this vigil. I began to walk slowly, circling the small perimeter, careful to maintain the unspoken trust that had formed. The city was waking in hushed tones. A distant bus rumbled down a cracked street. A shopkeeper's shutter clanged open, and Rex, ever watchful, raised his head at the sound, ears alert, eyes scanning with precision. He had lived in this world long enough to know its rhythms, its warnings, its dangers. He had survived, and he had learned to wait. My thoughts drifted again, pulled by the invisible threads of his past. I imagined him as a younger dog, the coat still glossy, the muscles still unbroken. He had known warmth once, I was certain of it. The kind of love only a child could give. The kind of bond that embeds itself into the marrow and never releases. Perhaps he had been part of a home where laughter lingered in the air like sunlight. Perhaps he had known the quiet contentment of a family that relied on him, that trusted him with the smallest lives, the most vulnerable moments. And then, as always, the shadow intruded. Perhaps an accident, perhaps a sudden fracture of circumstance. Human failure, the kind we all hope to avoid, but which comes nonetheless. I could picture it vividly. A hurried step, a lost balance, a scream that pierced his ears, and then the world shifting irreversibly. He had tried to intervene, of course. That much was certain. The way his paws bore scars, the faint limp that never left him, the haunted expression in his eyes, all of it spoke of one act that had changed him forever. One night that had shaped every morning thereafter. I kneeled and let my fingers brush the wet edge of the car seat blanket. There was no trace of the child, yet the air held a faint residue of presence, soft, almost imperceptible, like the scent of a lullaby long forgotten. And Rex, vigilant as ever, leaned closer to the blanket, nuzzling it gently, almost reverently. His breath steamed faintly in the cool morning air, a small tangible proof that he was alive, and that he had endured, and that he had never abandoned hope. I wondered how long he had waited here, whether days or weeks had passed unnoticed, marked only by rain and wind and the occasional distant footstep. He did not beg, did not whine. He did not allow despair to consume him, though I could see the weight of it in his posture. His loyalty was absolute, and it demanded acknowledgement. I felt it pressing against my chest, a silent insistence that someone had to see him, someone had to recognize his sacrifice, his vigilance, his relentless hope. As I watched, a faint memory stirred again, this time sharper, more precise. I saw a narrow hallway, walls scuffed with years of movement and memory. Rex trotted alongside a small child, their hands brushing, the child laughing, hair damp with bathwater, feet bare and soft on the hardwood floor. I could see the warmth in his eyes, the patience, the protective instinct already forming before it was truly needed. And then the chaos, sudden, irreparable, the day the world shifted, leaving him to carry grief alone. He had survived what many could not. He had endured what most would not. And yet here he was, still guarding, still waiting, still believing that the fragment of life he had loved so fiercely might return. I realized then that he was not simply attached to a child or a car seat or a blanket. He was attached to the memory of connection itself, to the possibility of restoration, to the faith that some bonds, even after trauma, even after loss, could endure. The mist began to lift as the sun crept higher, casting diffused light over wet streets. Rex's movements were deliberate as he shifted his weight, stretching, flexing his muscles, though ever careful with the injured leg. He turned his head slightly toward me, and in that moment I saw it, the faint glimmer of trust. Not full trust, not yet, but enough to allow observation, enough to permit a human presence without fear. I decided to speak softly, almost whispering to honor the solemnity of the scene. I don't know your story. I don't know why you've been left here, but I see you. I see what you've endured. He did not respond, at least not in words, but his eyes softened, and he nudged the blanket again with a gentle paw, as if affirming some small truth, that he was here, and he had not forgotten, and he would not stop guarding. The street seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind paused in its wandering, as if respecting the weight of grief and vigilance between us. In that quiet, I allowed myself to examine his body more closely. The scars along his shoulders were deeper than I had realized, punctures from fights perhaps, or accidents too sharp to recall. The stiffness in his hind legs suggested a long-term injury, untreated but borne with dignity. Each mark was not a failure, but a testament to endurance, a silent narrative written across muscle and fur. I thought again of the child wherever they might be. I imagined small hands, tiny fingers tracing Rex's ears, the softness of hair brushing against his coat, the warmth of laughter filling the spaces between scarred walls. I imagined the day he had lost that warmth, the day he had been left with memory as his only companion, and I felt a deep, aching sorrow settle in my chest. And yet even in sorrow there was hope. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it existed. It existed in the way he moved, in the careful nudges of his paw, in the alert tilt of his ears. It existed in his patience, in the unspoken trust he allowed to form, however tentatively, between us. It existed in the fact that he had not given up, had not walked away, had not surrendered to despair. Hours passed, though time felt suspended. The city began to wake more fully. The distant hum of engines, the faint clatter of shutters, the occasional bark of a dog far away. Rex remained vigilant, his body a monument to endurance and hope. And I remained beside him, a witness, a companion, a human drawn into a story not yet ready to be told, but whose gravity I could not ignore. It was then that I noticed the first subtle sign of something else. A disturbance in the air, a small ripple of movement, almost imperceptible. Rex's ears pricked sharply, his tail tensing. He rose slowly, deliberately, and approached the end of the street, his body a taut line of alertness. I followed cautiously, my own heartbeat rising, though I did not yet understand why. The object of his attention became clear, a discarded toy half buried in debris, its colors faded by sun and rain. He sniffed it, nudged it gently, and then, as though sensing its connection to memory, stepped back and lowered himself beside the car seat once more. The toy was trivial, meaningless to anyone else, yet it seemed to hold significance to him. It was a reminder of the small life he had loved, a fragment of connection he had not forgotten, a symbol of loyalty preserved. I sat quietly, letting the weight of his vigilance and memory press against me. And I realized, finally, that this was not merely a story about loss or waiting. It was a story about endurance, about the quiet strength required to hold love and memory close, even when the world seemed determined to erase it. It was a story that demanded patience, that unfolded slowly, deliberately, with every cautious movement of a loyal, scarred heart. Rex rested again, his head on the edge of the car seat, and I let myself breathe with him. Somewhere in the faint light and the lingering mist, I felt the first fragile connection forming, a bond not yet complete, but undeniable, one that promised revelation, trust, and perhaps the quiet return of hope. The mist lingered longer than expected that morning, curling through the empty streets like a quiet sigh. Rex remained near the car seat, his body low, coiled with the weight of vigilance and memory. I could see the tension in his muscles, the careful positioning of his paws, the subtle movements that marked him as a guardian who had known loss and refused to forget. Even the soft, persistent drizzle did not sway him. His attention was precise, measured, and unyielding. I watched him, feeling the slow, inexorable pull of connection between us, and realized that I was beginning to understand him. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the first tentative threads of trust. He allowed me to sit near him, though he never let his eyes leave the car seat, never let his focus wander. In that quiet, soaked world, I became acutely aware of the small signs, the imperceptible cues that revealed the depth of his awareness. A twitch of the ear, a shift of weight, a subtle sniff of air. Each one spoke volumes, even in silence. And then I noticed it, a faint movement beyond the mist near the edge of the street. At first I thought it was the wind catching a piece of litter, but Rex's ears twitched sharply, and his head lifted, nostrils flaring. His tail, previously relaxed, stiffened in a slow, deliberate motion. He rose, every muscle taut with anticipation, and stepped toward the shadow. I rose cautiously, uncertain, my own heartbeat quickening, though I did not yet know why. The movement resolved into a small figure, a child no more than a toddler, standing uncertainly on the edge of the damp street. The mist curled around the child's coat, blurring the outline, softening the edges of the small form. The child's gaze fell immediately on Rex, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Neither the child nor the dog moved, yet a quiet recognition passed between them, invisible but palpable. Rex approached slowly, deliberately, as if testing the waters of memory. His nose twitched, taking in the scent that lingered faintly around the child, a mixture of clean baby skin, the lingering trace of home, and something indefinable, a tether of presence that spoke to the loyalty in his heart. The child took a tentative step forward, small fingers outstretched, and Rex lowered his head, allowing the touch without hesitation. It was a careful, silent exchange, a first acknowledgement of connection without words. I knelt on the curb, my breath shallow, unsure whether to speak or remain still. This was not my story to narrate, not yet. I could only witness silently as a bond that had lain dormant for years began to awaken. The child's hand rested briefly on Rex's fur, then retracted only to reach again a small gesture of trust and curiosity. Rex's eyes softened, and he allowed the child's presence to settle near him, a protective warmth radiating from his body without need for demonstration. The air held a fragile tension, the kind that marks the first moments of a bond too deep for explanation. I could feel the weight of history between them, the echoes of memory in Rex's careful movements, the cautious curiosity in the child's gestures. They were discovering each other slowly, deliberately, each waiting for the other to reveal the next piece of trust. I noticed the small details, the child's bare feet damp from the mist, the slight tremor in the fingers as they traced the curve of Rex's shoulder, the way the eyes lingered on the frayed edges of the blanket in the car seat, as if recognizing something long forgotten. And Rex, for his part, remained entirely present, entirely patient, a sentinel not only of memory but of hope, of possibility. I remembered again the fragments of his past I had imagined, the child he had once loved, the home he had once known, the sudden rupture that had left him alone. And now in this quiet street, in the soft grey morning light, it seemed that the threads of fate had begun to weave themselves into something more tangible, something fragile but unbroken. Rex was not alone. The child was not alone. And though neither could speak of the past, both understood it through instinct, through presence, through the invisible language of trust and longing. I dared to move slightly closer, careful not to intrude. The child did not flinch, nor did Rex. There was a rhythm to their interaction, a slow, deliberate dance of recognition and reassurance. The toddler's small hands rested gently on Rex's fur, tracing the contours of his scars, unaware of their history but sensing their significance. Rex leaned into the touch, his body softening, not from weakness but from acceptance, from the quiet understanding that some connections transcend explanation. Time passed in irregular pulses. A distant car hummed along a nearby avenue. The mist began to thin, revealing more of the street and the broken windows of abandoned buildings. The child shifted slightly, sitting down on the wet pavement, fingers brushing the frayed blanket in the car seat. Rex settled beside them, body low and protective, his head resting near the child's small shoulder. In that posture, he became both guardian and companion, a living testament to loyalty and patience. I realized then that the story had shifted. No longer was Rex merely a sentinel of absence or memory. He had become a bridge, a living conduit between past and present, between loss and potential redemption. And the child, for their part, was already responding intuitively to the weight and warmth of that presence. They did not speak, nor did they need to. Their gestures, their quiet attention were enough. The air carried faint traces of morning, damp leaves, distant smoke, and the persistent scent of rain-soaked earth. I could hear the subtle rise and fall of Rex's breathing, steady and deliberate, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the child's own small inhalations. It was almost sacred, this quiet communion, this slow unfolding of recognition and trust. Hours seemed to pass unnoticed. I stayed on the edge of the street, watching the child's hands explore. Rex's responses measured and deliberate. Every twitch of an ear, every shift of weight, every gentle nuzzle of the blanket was imbued with meaning. They were speaking in a language older than words, one that had been shaped by instinct, memory, and the quiet desire for connection. And then, in a moment so subtle it could have been imagined, the child leaned forward and whispered something to Rex. I could not hear the words, but the effect was immediate. Rex's head lifted slightly, eyes alert, ears flicked forward, and a soft, almost imperceptible wag of his tail passed through him. The bond had solidified, at least in that instant. He had recognized the presence not just as familiar, but as meaningful. He had accepted the child into his vigil, into his waiting, into the quiet sacredness of his loyalty. I exhaled slowly, realizing that this was the threshold. The story that had begun with absence, with memory, with grief, was now entering a new phase. Rex was no longer waiting alone. The child was here, the living echo of connection, the possibility of healing and restoration. And in that realization, I felt the first stirrings of hope, fragile and tentative but undeniable. The morning light continued to filter through the mist, highlighting the damp textures of the street, the shine of Rex's coat despite its scars, the soft curves of the child's small figure. And in that light, in that suspended moment, the story had shifted. We had moved from observation to participation, from waiting to witness, from loss to the possibility of connection. Rex rested his head on the edge of the car seat again, the child's small hand brushing the blanket beside him. The quiet vigil continued, but it was no longer a vigil of absence or longing alone. It was a vigil of recognition, of shared memory, of the slow, deliberate forming of trust. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would demand patience, courage, and the quiet understanding that some bonds once formed cannot be broken. The sun climbed higher, though its light remained muted, filtered through a thin layer of clouds that left the streets washed in a pale silver haze. The mist had lifted entirely now, but the dampness persisted, clinging to walls, puddles, and the edges of the abandoned buildings that lined the block. Rex stayed beside the car seat, his body coiled like a spring, every movement deliberate, protective. The child had shifted closer, settling beside him, their small hand resting lightly on his thick coat. I observed from a short distance, careful not to intrude. Every subtle gesture carried meaning. The way Rex lowered his muzzle to the child's shoulder without prompting, the gentle flick of his ears toward any approaching sound, the occasional nudge of his paw against the frayed blanket, as if to reassure the child that it was safe. There was no fear in the child, only a quiet curiosity, a tentative exploration of presence and trust. I wondered how long Rex had waited for this moment, how many days, nights, or storms had passed, while he stood sentinel, carrying the weight of memory and loyalty in every sinew of his body. Now finally his vigilance was met with recognition, and though neither could speak, the silent acknowledgement between them was profound. The child reached again, tracing the scarred ridge along his shoulder, and I saw a subtle shift in Rex's eyes, a softening that was almost imperceptible but deeply significant. I remembered the first time I had seen him, that night by the burned house, and how his grief had radiated outward like a tangible presence. Now confronted with life instead of absence, he seemed to absorb it with cautious reverence. It was not playfulness or joy in the way a healthy dog might express, but something deeper, a profound, patient acceptance of the possibility of restoration. He was allowing himself to hope, slowly, deliberately, for the first time in years. The child leaned closer to the blanket, fingers brushing against its frayed edges, and then extended a small hand toward Rex's muzzle. He lowered his head gradually, letting the gesture meet his own. The two of them lingered in that space, a tableau of quiet trust, bound not by words but by instinct and recognition. It was as though the dog understood in some ancient, visceral way that this small being carried the echo of all he had once known, and that in their connection, the fragments of his past could find form again. I noticed the faint tremor in Rex's paw, a subtle quiver that betrayed both age and old injury, yet he held himself upright, steady, unyielding. It was a lesson in endurance, in loyalty, in the kind of patience that could not be taught but only lived. I could feel it pressing against me, a weight that demanded acknowledgement. There was something sacred in the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he accepted the child's touch without tension, without hesitation. Minutes or perhaps hours passed in this silent communion. The city outside seemed to fade, its noises distant and inconsequential. All that existed was the misty street, the pale light, the frayed blanket, the car seat, the child and the dog. And in that space, the quiet unfolding of trust and connection became tangible, almost tactile. I could see it in the slow blinking of the dog's eyes, the deliberate positioning of his body, the child's tiny exploratory gestures that grew bolder with each passing moment. At one point, the child rolled a small waterlogged toy toward Rex, who sniffed it once and then, in a gesture of remarkable gentleness, nudged it back toward the child. It was a simple exchange, yet it carried layers of meaning. An acknowledgement of presence, a lesson in patience, a mutual understanding of safety and care. The child's laughter, soft, airy, almost swallowed by the damp air, was not loud or boisterous, but it was enough to make the dog's tail give a subtle, deliberate sweep. For the first time, a sense of playfulness, however faint, threaded itself through the air between them. I allowed myself a quiet exhale, letting the moment settle over me. It was rare to witness such pure, unspoken trust, and rarer still to feel its gravity without intruding. Rex was teaching, in his own way, what it meant to endure, to hope, to protect without demand or expectation. And the child, in turn, was teaching the dog what it meant to be received, to be acknowledged, to matter. Their bond, formed in silence and patience, was becoming a lifeline, fragile yet unbreakable, tender yet steadfast. I thought again of his past, the injuries, the scars, the nights of waiting, the absence that had defined him, and I realized that he was not merely protecting the child from the world. He was protecting the world from itself, from the tendency to forget, from the tendency to overlook the sacred threads that bind beings together. In his loyalty, there was a quiet insistence that care, patience, and love, however small or tentative, were worth guarding, worth preserving, worth honoring. Rex shifted slightly, letting his nose rest on the child's shoulder. I could see the faint rise and fall of his chest in time with the child's own breath, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize them in a way that felt almost ceremonial. The mist hung low, curling around the edges of the street, softening the outlines of abandoned buildings, of broken windows, of the detritus of the city that had once seemed so harsh and unforgiving. In this softened world, the bond between dog and child became luminous, almost ethereal, a quiet defiance of absence and loss. The child's small fingers drifted toward the dog's scars, tracing them as though trying to understand the stories they told. Rex remained still, patient, letting the touch linger, allowing the child to explore without fear. It was not simply tolerance, it was recognition, acceptance, and perhaps even gratitude. He had waited so long, endured so much, and now finally someone had come to meet him where he was, to acknowledge the weight of his patience and the depth of his loyalty. I remained on the edge of the street, silent, humbled by the intimacy unfolding before me. It was not dramatic or urgent. There were no loud declarations, no confrontations, no sudden revelations. There was only presence, patience, and the slow weaving of trust and recognition between two beings who had, in different ways, been defined by absence and loss. Time moved differently in that quiet space. A faint breeze stirred the mist, carrying the scent of damp earth and rain-soaked leaves. Rex's ears twitched at distant sounds, but his gaze never wavered from the child. The child's attention, in turn, remained focused on the dog, tracing fur, observing scars, feeling the steady warmth of a body that had carried so much, yet remained unbroken. I could feel as I watched that something was beginning to shift, not in sudden, dramatic ways, but in small, almost imperceptible motions. The child's confidence grew, their gestures bolder, their trust deeper. Rex's vigilance softened, his patience blooming into gentle engagement. The two of them together were beginning to write a new narrative, one that honored the past but allowed for the fragile beginnings of hope, of companionship, of healing. I exhaled again quietly, letting the weight of observation and presence settle within me. It was a moment of profound clarity. This was why I had been drawn here, why I had witnessed Rex's vigil, why I had felt the quiet pull of his story. The child's presence was not incidental. It was the catalyst for a transformation, subtle but profound, that would ripple through both their lives in ways neither could yet comprehend. And so, in the pale, misty morning, the quiet connection deepened. Rex rested his head on the edge of the car seat. The child nestled against him, hands exploring, learning, trusting. The world beyond the street remained distant, grey, and indifferent. But here, in this fragile sanctuary, patience, vigilance, and the slow flowering of trust had begun to take root. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the damp street, casting long, softened shadows that stretched like tentative fingers along cracked pavement. The mist had entirely lifted now, leaving behind a quiet, fragile clarity. Rex remained near the car seat, the child nestled against him, their small hand resting atop his thick fur. It was a stillness that spoke louder than any movement could, a presence that carried the weight of memory, patience, and cautious trust. I watched them carefully, knowing that this was the threshold of transformation. Not sudden, not dramatic, but subtle, incremental. Rex's body relaxed slightly, the tautness of his muscles easing as he accepted the child's proximity as normal, natural, safe. He was no longer merely guarding. He was beginning to bond, to integrate the child into the rhythm of his being. The small gestures, the tentative touches, the quiet acknowledgement of presence. They were shaping a new reality, one in which he had a purpose beyond memory, beyond waiting. The street remained empty, except for distant echoes of urban life. A soft wind stirred, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and the faint perfume of decaying leaves. Every so often a crow would caw from the rooftops above, and Rex would lift his head, ears flicking, alert but unthreatened. His vigilance had shifted subtly, from a posture of defensive guarding to one of measured observation. He was learning slowly that this small being posed no danger, that the presence beside him was a gift rather than a test. The child's fingers wandered across his scars once more, tracing the pale ridges along his shoulders and back. Rex leaned into the touch, eyes softening further, and in that motion I saw something extraordinary. He was beginning to forgive the world. Not fully, not quickly, but enough to allow life to flow toward him again, to accept connection without fear. The transformation was imperceptible at first, a flicker in the tail, a subtle shift in posture, but it was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. I moved a few steps closer, careful not to intrude, and observed the interaction with renewed fascination. The child, now more confident, explored his muzzle gently, then retreated, watching the dog's reaction as if learning the unspoken rules of trust. Rex did not flinch. He did not move away. He allowed the exploration, the curiosity, the silent communication that passed between them. There was a lesson being imparted, one that required patience, presence, and a deep understanding of rhythm. Hours passed with this slow, deliberate intimacy. The air carried the faint hum of distant traffic, a soft whistle of wind through the trees, the occasional drip from gutters slicked by the morning's rain.